I will introduce our speaker, Sue Reich. Sue has been a quilt maker since childhood and is a nationally recognized quilt historian, lecturer, author, and appraiser. She was part of a team that documented more than 3,000 quilts over 6 years for the Connecticut Quilt Search Project, culminating in the publication of Quilts and Quilt Makers covering Connecticut. She is a member of the American Quilt Study Group and regularly shares her quilt collection and expertise through presentations and exhibitions. The Historical Society has partnered with Sue on multiple projects, including our Connecticut Quilt exhibit in 2004, a Quilt Discovery Day for our visitors, and a Quilt Day with the American Quilt Study Group. So we're really happy to get back in touch with Sue and have her join us again. And with that, again, use the Q&A in the chat if you need to communicate with us. But other than that, I hope everyone enjoys the lecture, and I'll see you all in a little bit.
Thank you, Alex. And welcome, everybody. I know there are some people that make quilts that you're going to be seeing that are on today, that have tuned in tonight, and thank you for coming. And there may be some people that are just quilt enthusiasts, a lot of quilt makers. I want to thank you for joining me tonight, and I hope you enjoy this lecture and it makes you very glad to be finally getting into the Christmas spirit. So I call this presentation, A Quilter's Night Before Christmas, a Treasury of Tradition. Let me see it. This is not going forward. Okay, I want to thank Kate Zullo and Alex Dubois for inviting me to share this presentation with you today. And this is the Litchfield Historical Society. I don't know if you saw the backdrop behind Alex when he was speaking earlier, but one of the quilts that you saw, the first one actually, was made by Jerusha Clark Peck. We documented that quilt during the Connecticut Quilt Search Project, and it could be in the show because it's red and green. So first, I'd like to take you to share our family tradition with Christmas, and I blame my love of Christmas on my German roots. In the 90s, when my son was stationed in Germany, we traveled to Germany for Christmas, and we met up with our family, our German family in Bavaria. They invited us to go to this town in Austria. It's called Wildschönau. And we went there and spent Christmas there. We stayed in a ski hut like this on a mountain. And on Christmas Eve, our family walked up this mountain and they cut their tree. And this is an example of the tree that they cut. They brought it down on Christmas Eve and they put real candles on the tree. Everybody sang Stille Nacht, which is, of course, Silent Night. And they handed out Christmas presents that were similar to what we would include in stockings. It was a very humbling experience, and it really changed my outlook about Christmas and what is really important about the holiday. Then after that, we had dinner, and at 11 o'clock, the church bells rang in the valley for 1 hour until midnight. And then all the adults that could stay awake went to this church, and we experienced midnight mass there. And in keeping with good German tradition, after we attended midnight mass, everybody went to the local guest house and had some beer. So this is an example of what my Christmas would look like. And we keep it very simple with the tree, with lights in the windows. I have a Santa collection that comes out, but I also incorporate quilts into the scene. I love to make gingerbread houses with my family, and actually these are gingerbread lighthouses. So these are my grandkids, all decorating their own gingerbread lighthouse. Of course, baking Christmas cookies and incorporating quilts. So this is all about keeping quilts in Christmas. So those of you that are quilters and quilt collectors out there, most of us absolutely love red and green quilts. This is a photograph from the American Quilt Study Group and some of the wonderful examples of red and green quilts that we see at our annual conference, which is usually in the fall in September or October. So first I want to share with you some of the red and green quilts in my collection. This is a block. It is actually was made by, signed by a woman named Hannah Shepard. She was from Greenwich, New Jersey, and the date on this is 1867. What really attracted me to this was this verse that is inscribed on the block. She maketh herself coverings of tapestry. And that comes from Proverbs 31, and this is line 22, which is beautiful and one of the most popularly inscribed lines from the Bible on quilts. Another example of a quilt in my collection is this close-up. It's a detail. You can see this is a pineapple. This is a very unusual pineapple. Dates to about 1850, which is when most of these quilts date. And this is all pieced in and then it's appliqued down. This quilt is a very common quilt for Connecticut. We documented about 4 of these in our documentation project. It is called Shoemaker's Puzzle, but around 1900, it was renamed Connecticut. So that was one of the reasons I purchased this quilt. You can see the positive, negative that each of the blocks forms to get that wonderful design. And then this is a fragment of a quilt. It was part of a 4-block quilt. What I loved about this is this detail. It is dated 1861. So those of you that have been quilt making for a while and got involved in making Civil War quilts with all the browns and the dark, muddy kind of colors that they associated with Civil War, red and green are really Civil War colors also. This is a quilt from 1870 that I purchased in northeastern Pennsylvania, and I think this woman, this quilt maker, was probably 100 years before her time, because these flowers remind me of the mod flowers from the 1960s. This is a close-up of that quilt. And for those of you that are worried about your quilting stitches, this woman's quilting stitches are about 2 to the inch. So you can see the wonderful fan design, but this is just a colorful, very powerful quilt. And then here we have another quilt from my collection. This is a summer top. It is much more refined than the previous quilt, with the tulips that are marching around. And this is a close-up of that. And when I say summer top, it means that it was finished as a top to be used on a bed, but it was never quilted and it wasn't backed. Another red and green quilt that is a very popular pattern in Pennsylvania is the Rolling Stone. This particular quilt is from Pottsgrove, Pennsylvania, which is a little north of Lancaster, a little west of Allentown. And you can see also that it is the signature quilt and that there are stamped names on this quilt. And then this is a favorite of mine. This is Courthouse Steps. This quilt and a number of the others that you've seen are going to be on exhibit at the Paducah Rotary exhibit in April in Paducah during Quilt Week. This is also a summer top. And what I love about this is this blue patch that she added. Obviously, she ran out of fabric that she couldn't replace, so she stuck in blue there, and that whimsical touch just makes this quilt so charming. So around 1900, this quilt was appliqued. It is also a pineapple quilt. I purchased this as a top, and then Pat Haluska from Southbury did the quilting on this because the top was very sturdy. And there's a close-up of her wonderful quilting. This quilt will also be on display in Paducah. And not all red and green quilts are applique. This is a red and green piece quilt. I bought this also as a top. It's probably late 19th century, early 20th century. And what I loved about it was this whimsical patch here. It's a variable star is what the pattern is, but here she did the green on the background fabric, and then the red is the star. And there's a close-up of that. Moving into the 20th century, red and green was still popular, and this is called Cottage Tulips. This is a 1930s pattern. And then ending some of the quilts of my collection that will also be on exhibit in Paducah is this one. This is Anemone. I thought it was maybe poppy, but it isn't. It's an Alice Brooks pattern that was published in the 1930s. And this is a close-up of that. Again, I purchased the top. It was very sturdy, so I felt that it could be quilted, and Pat Haluska did wonderful quilting on this. And all of the stitching along the applique is all buttonhole stitch and zigzag. So let's talk about the dyes a little bit. We couldn't have the red and green quilts until we got really good red and green dyes. And so first we'll talk about red dye. Red is the color of passion. I love this picture because it certainly shows passion. And from the Adams Sentinel, Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, September 3rd, 1849, it stated, a deer color, every pound weight of cochineal contains 70,000 insects boiled to death, so that the annual sacrifice of insectile life to procure our scarlet and crimson dyes amounts to about 49 millions of these small members of creation. So one of the early ways to get the red color was with an insect that grows on cactuses, cacti in Mexico. And people would collect these, and then they would be boiled, and that is where they got the cochineal dye. So that was one way to get the red dye. Another way, and probably the most popular, was from the madder plant. And most of the prints that you're going to see are turkey red or a combination of cochineal and turkey red dye. Turkey red is from it is a color, but it's more a process. So you can put a number of pieces of fabric that were dyed with turkey red beside one another, and they will each be a little bit different in color, depending on what the dye process is. The process takes days and days to get the dye right, and we never have had a stable dye until we had the turkey red, and that's one of the reasons why we have so many wonderful red and green quilts from this time period. And here are some examples of those turkey red prints that you see in quilts from the mid 19th century all the way to the end of the 19th century. So if you see a quilt like this is pattern is called Love Apple, but the brown area was red. The red was fugitive because it was a later 19th century red, maybe Congo red. And over time, the red dye color just ran away, and you get this tan brown look to that quilt. So now we'll talk about green, and it's not easy being green. Green was another very, very popular color. This is the dining room at Mount Vernon. George Washington had his dining room painted in this very dark green. Early green, before we had chemical green in the third quarter and the fourth quarter of the 19th century, was a vegetable dye. And I don't know if you all remember learning about colors when you were in primary school, but you got the color green by mixing blue and yellow, right? So that's what they did with quilts also. They mixed blue with yellow dyes, which were very successful, and they got green. And this is often referred to as a two-step green because of that. Now this is a quilt that is a little ratty in condition, but it's a good learning piece. You have, I'll give you a close-up of this. Right there, you see where the yellow color ran away. Something got spilled here that bleached out the yellow color, and the blue came through. In that same quilt, we have areas where the blue ran away and the yellow comes through. So it's a really good learning piece and proves that this is indeed a two-step green. And I just want to tell you that red and green is not just popular in one part of the country. The documentation books are excellent sources for looking for wonderful 19th century red and green quilts. And they can be found all over the United States. These are some of the excellent quilts that we documented here in Connecticut, and they all date to the 1850s. This is one from the New York book, the New Jersey book, and there's a close-up of that. Many of these applique quilts were also signature quilts. Here we have a quilt from the Maryland book with those wonderful turkey red prints. This one is a 4-block quilt from the Ohio book. Here we have a Wheel of Fortune from the Georgia book. This is coxcombs and currants from the Kentucky documentation book. And even Arizona found red and green quilts in the later part of the 19th century. And that's an example of that. So when did red and green become associated with Christmas? Because early on, it wasn't really until probably 1830, 1840 that Christmas really got to be a big, big thing. It was all about red and green. So let's talk about the poinsettia. The poinsettia is a symbol of the Holy Star of Bethlehem. In Christian tradition, the Star of Bethlehem led the Magi many miles across the desert on their journey to visit the Christ child. And you often see poinsettias in quilts. The holly leaf. The holly leaves were symbolic of the crown of thorns, the berries representing the drops of blood from Jesus's wounds. The tree became known as Christ's thorn and the holy tree. In Germany and Scandinavia, the holy bough was called Christ's thorn and righteous branch. Carols and Christmas carols such as the holly and the ivy and deck the halls extol this season's plant. The candy canes are replicas of the shepherd's crock. It was children's candy originating in Cologne by the cathedral choir master in 1670. It is ideal for hanging on branches of the Christmas trees. And it was a tradition that was passed on and eventually became striped. And then the partridge, the 12 Days of Christmas also has Christmas connotation. The partridge in the pear tree symbolizes Jesus. The 2 turtle doves, the Old Testament and the New Testament. 3 French hens were the 3 kings bearing gifts. 4 calling birds were the 4 Gospels. 5 gold rings was the Torah, the first 5 books of the Old Testament. 6 geese a-laying were the 6 days of creation. 7 swans a-swimming were the 7 gifts of the Holy Spirit. 8 maids a-milking were the 8 Beatitudes. 9 ladies dancing were the 9 fruits of the Holy Spirit. 10 lords of leaping were the 10 commandments. 11 pipers piping were the 11 faithful apostles. And 12 drummers drumming were the 12 points of the Apostles' Creed. So again, so many of our now kind of secular traditions had religious roots that go back hundreds and hundreds of years. And then there's the Christmas tree. The use of the evergreens, wreaths, and garlands symbolize eternal life, and it was a custom of the ancient Egyptians, the Chinese, and the Hebrews. Worship was common also among pagan Europeans, and then it converted to Christianity. So in around 1996, when my eldest child went off to Europe in the Army, and I knew that he would not be coming home for a couple of years for a home Christmas, I decided that I was going to cover our family's beds with Christmas the next time we share a Christmas at home. And I don't know if this applies to all of you, but at Christmas, I always want to be sewing on a Christmassy quilt. And I was able to piece these blocks during Christmas of 1996 and then make this into a quilt. We have about 60 blocks here that they're all stars. I designed all these and drafted them from Barbara Brackman's book on piece quilts, and then I pieced it together. I challenged myself to use only my scraps, so that was important because I had a lot of Christmassy scraps. I want to show you some close-ups of this, and you all will recognize these wonderful fabrics from the 1990s and the 1980s. So this is one star and this is another. These blocks are 6 inches square. And there you see it on one of the beds in our bedroom. So this is another quilt that I made. This is a Quiltmaker pattern. And I love this because I was able to use a lot of sampler red prints, not turkey red, red prints. And when this quilt is on a bed, and there's a close-up of that, it's the white stars that you really see, particularly if the candles that are in the windows are the only light in the room. These white stars really pop, and it's very, very pretty at night and very Christmassy. And then this is another quilt. I'm not going to show them all to you, but this is another quilt that I made. I had all this wonderful red and green plaid fabric in these Santa prints. And one of my children's favorite songs at Christmas was Mitch Miller's Must Be Santa. So I appliqued that around the border. Here's a close-up of some of those blocks. And there you have it on one of the beds. So what we're really here today to talk about is the night before Christmas. And about 4 years ago, two of my friends, Mary Kerr and Bonnie Dwyer, whose quilt you will see later on, met in Colonial Williamsburg at Christmas time. And we went to the Abby Aldrich Rockefeller Museum. And there was an exhibit for Clemency Moore. And it was noted that he wrote his famous poem in 1822. And I was inspired by that and the fact that in a few years, it was going to be the 200th anniversary of the Night Before Christmas writing. And when you think about how that poem has really charmed 10 generations of young people, including those of us watching today, I thought, what a great idea for a quilt exhibit. So I put out to my friends in the quilt history world and the quilt making world the challenge to take a stanza from the poem and interpret that into a quilt. And immediately I had 28 takers because there are 28 stanzas to the Night Before Christmas. So the requirements of the challenge was to create a quilt size 24 by 30 inches in a vertical set to represent the stanza that you chose, but not to include the stanza on the quilt. It could be inspired by an antique book, a postcard, a card, a coloring book, and most of the images of the Night Before Christmas stanzas are universal. It must include a miniature quilt or a quilted image somewhere in the quilt. It must have a 4-inch sleeve on the back with the label. I asked that embellishments that extend too far off the quilt surface be avoided. No photo transfers except for faces if desired, and to read in shades of red and green with other accent colors. So a little bit about Clemency Moore. Clemency Moore lived in New York City. He was a minister and he taught at a seminary along the Hudson River. He lived in a home called Chelsea. Oops. Let me go back. And he penned his famous poem as a gift to his children in 1822. It wasn't until 1823 that the poem was published, however, and then it really got popular around 1840. So the quilts I'm going to be showing you now are actually in a book. I approached my publisher to see if he would be interested in publishing the book for the Quillers about the night before Christmas. And he agreed. And he also requested that we have quilts that could then be patterned. So I'm going to show you those, and then we'll go into the night before Christmas quilts. So this is Dasher. It's a red quilt. It's a wild goose chase, as you can see. The quilts in the book were patterned by Ann Holt, who is a wonderful patterner and expert quilt maker. And she and I have coordinated in writing a number of books, particularly for Quilts of Valor. So this is Dasher and Dancer. Now, I'm not sure. This is a 19th century quilt. And depending on the block, it could have been pieced either on the diagonal or straight. I still have not found a name for this. So if any of you recognize this pattern, please fire me an email or add it to the chat column. A number of quilts that I'm sharing I picked because their patterns were not common and did not have names, or could the names be found. So any of you that recognize this pattern, I'd be happy if you would share the name. This is a Tree of Life design, and this is Prancer. So it was Anne's idea to name these 9 quilts after the reindeer. This is a close-up. This is a late 19th century, early 20th century top that I purchased. It was in very good condition, and Pat Haluska did wonderful quilting on this. This is a 20th century quilt. Again, looks like a pattern we've all seen, but couldn't find it anywhere. So if any of you recognize this design, please let me know. Here we have, so that was Vixen. This is Comet. And this is a copy of a World War I era quilt. It is an absolutely beautiful pattern. The original was done in red, white, and blue, but I thought it would look wonderful in red and green, again with that cheddar addition. And then I found a beautiful toile with the village scene to put around it. So this is Comet. This is Cupid. And you can see Cupid because it's hanging right now in an exhibit in Washington Depot at the Judy Black Memorial Garden. Here we have Donner is next, and this is Donner. And this is a pattern that I created. They're all 8-inch hexes, and I wanted them to look like snowflakes, although someone suggested this actually looks like coronavirus, which is appropriate because I made it during the virus. And here we have a Christmas tree. This is Blitzen, again made with those 8-inch hexes. This is also on exhibit right now at the Judy Black Center in Washington Depot. And lastly, Rudolph. And this is a takeoff on a red and green World War I quilt that is in my collection and will be on exhibit in Paducah. But this is a really fun quilt. So moving on to the night before Christmas, this is the cover quilt. I made this particular quilt. I embroidered the night before Christmas on the top, and we have the miniature quilts are there above the fireplace. and actually used as a tree skirt. I made this quilt to represent what our family living room looked like when we were living in Ohio. We had a brick fireplace. Our 5 stockings represent my husband, myself, and our 3 children. And then the nutcrackers represent my German heritage. Of course, every Christmas Eve, we would put out a plate of Christmas cookies for Santa and the reindeer. And the far back is an eagle to represent our family's patriotic spirit. So, 'twas the night before Christmas when all through the house, not a creature was stirring, not even a mouse. And this quilt was made by Marjorie Farquharson. Marjorie's from Chatham, Massachusetts. And in Marjorie's artist statement, she wrote, Clement Clark Moore lived in Chelsea, his family estate in New York City, when he penned his famous Christmas poem. His daughter, Mary Seymour Ogden, sketched their home for the first published color edition of the work. Marjorie used her sketch of the house as inspiration for the opening stanza and took the artistic liberty of including Christmas ornaments, even though they wouldn't be introduced as a Christmas tradition until later in the 19th century. And of course, there was a little mouse, and the miniature quilt in Marjorie's larger quilt is the stoop of the mansion. So the stockings were hung by the chimney with care in hopes that St. Nicholas would soon be there. And this is the quilt that was made by Teddy Pruitt of Lake City, Florida. Teddy writes, this poem usually conjures images of a Victorian Christmas, but I wanted to portray a cabin Christmas, simple, basic, but still filled with joy, love, and anticipation. This was meant to be a Southern cabin, but it could be anywhere. Teddy is a true artist. She used fragments of antique stockings above her mantle here. And then this is the image of her quilt on the bed that is actually pieced in. The children were nestled all snug in their beds, while visions of sugar plums danced in their heads. This quilt was made by Susan Fiandella of Vero Beach, Florida. Susan chose this stanza of the poem to create her quilt. There is nothing more exciting for a child on Christmas Eve than going to bed in anticipation of the next morning's celebration. We live in a very different era than that of the poem, but children everywhere still love Christmas and dream. It was the same for me and my 4 sisters, and it is the same for my 2 grandchildren, depicted in my pictorial of the Timeless poem. And here you have her grandson and her granddaughter, and then marching around them, and their head are all the images of sugar plums and fairies and presents and wonderful things. And then her quilt is lying on the bed covering them. And Mama in her kerchief and I in my cap had just settled our brains for a long winter's nap. This quilt was made by Lisa Erlandson of Gainesville, Texas. In Lisa's artist statement, she stated, the stanza certainly has more meaning to me now than it did as a child. Preparing for that visit from Santa and for the festivities to come on Christmas Day definitely makes one wish for a long winter's nap. When I envisioned this quilt, I wanted to portray a setting that could have been seen in 1822 when this poem was written. So I researched the bed styles and even the type of gas lamp, an argan lamp, that might have been used 200 years ago. It's a little hard to see, but she actually did candle wicking on her bed cover, which is pretty amazing, and it would have been typical of that time period. And the narrator of the poem and Mama are settling their brains in an early 1820s bedroom. Many people describe the sky such as to be covered with a blanket of stars, but of course, we all know that in reality, it's a quilt of stars. The sawtooth would have been a quilt pattern in use 200 years ago. As a child, I remember searching the night skies on Christmas Eve, looking for Santa and wondering which bright star was the Christmas star that the wise men had seen and followed. So you see in the top upper right, we have Lisa's quilt. She's got the candlewick spread on the bed, and then the star block in the upper left, which is a wonderful piece. When out on the lawn, there arose such a clatter, I sprang from my bed to see what was the matter. This piece was done by Marcia Reagan of Rochester, New York. Martha has been quilting for over 30 years, she said, but this was her first art quilt. Her miniature quilt is a 9-patch that is lying on the bed, and you see Father hopping out of bed onto a braided rug. Away to the window I flew like a flash, tore open the shutters and threw up the sash. This quilt was made by Carol Poitras of Newmarket, New Hampshire. Carol has always had a love for The Night Before Christmas by Clemency Moore. Although my children are grown, I still read the book every Christmas Eve, she said. I completed this project with my fabric stash and did not buy a thing. The crochet curtain pull and the decoration of the quilted shade were made by my grandmother, Mary Ann May Moore, who was born in 1885. As a child, I often wondered if Clemency Moore was a long-lost relative. So here you see a miniature quilt in the bottom, and then again at the top for the valance of the window. The moon on the breast of the new fallen snow gave the luster of midday to objects below. This is a quilt that was made by Sharon Waddell of Windsor, New York. Sharon wanted to portray the stillness of the night, so she kept the scene very simple. Looking down out of the window, you see nothing but the quilt hanging on the line with full moon rising. The little quilt is pieced. Its shadow is a mixture of fabric paints, and the stars are both fabric paint and thread. When what to my wondering eyes should appear but a miniature sleigh and 8 tiny reindeer. This quilt was made by Madge Ziegler of Newark, Delaware. Madge is possibly the only other person I know who celebrates Christmas with more vigor than me. With a collection of she stated, with a collection of copies of The Night Before Christmas spanning almost 50 years, Madge had almost 45 books to consult and combine ideas for her quilt. Many hours were spent trying to create the sense of perspective, choosing woodwork fabric, and portraying a face. She chose a well-felted wool sweater that was ruined by aggressive washing many years ago to create the robe, and cut down a Christmas log cabin table runner to make the valance. With the little old driver so lively and quick, I knew in a moment it must be Saint Nick. So this is a quilt that I made. I wanted to portray just Saint Nick, and I wanted to try a new technique with my new Janome sewing machine. So I cut out Saint Nick as one whole, and then I machine appliqued that down. And then I have miniature quilts in the pom-pom area of Saint Nick and also the stars. So that quilt was made by me. I live in Washington Depot, Connecticut. More rapid than eagles, his coursers they came, and he whistled and shouted and called them by name. This quilt was made by Jill Mazzaros of Cambridge Springs, Pennsylvania. And Jill wrote in her artist statement, snowy farm scenes are familiar in bucolic Crawford County, Pennsylvania, where Jill calls home. With proximity to Lake Erie, the county also receives its share of lake effect snow. Her quilt captures the popularity of barn quilts. During the past 2 decades, quilt blocks have been painted on the sides of barns. Jill calls her quilt "My Little Farm in the Hills of PA." Living on a farm in northwestern Pennsylvania, I see eagles almost daily. Those eagles are what inspired me to create this scene in my quilt. This is how I always envision Santa as he flies overhead our farm on Christmas Eve. Now Dasher, now Dancer, now Prancer and Vixen, on Comet, on Cupid, on Donner and Blitzen. This quilt is made by Sandra Strarley of Fillmore, Utah. And Sandra wrote, she was excited to get this stanza as she had designed an applique reindeer block years ago and thought it would make a great reindeer crew. She created a pyramid of reindeer playing on the language that seemed to depict a stack of reindeer standing on top of each other. She made custom saddle blankets that resemble quilts for each reindeer using different fabric and patterns, and then cut and ID'd the team members' names on their quilted blankets. Her favorite are the wonky stars in the corners, and if you look carefully, you'll see the lead rope going from Santa to the first reindeer. To the top of the porch, to the top of the wall, now dash away, all. Here we have a quilt that was made by Doris Bloom of Cumberland Gap, Tennessee. And Doris wrote, "'Twas the night before Christmas" is one of my daughter-in-law's favorite poems. Christmas wouldn't be complete without reading it multiple times during the Christmas season. Doris chose to depict Santa flying his sleigh past their house and up the porch. She made the house of log cabin blocks, along with the peace pine trees. She finished off her quilt in her favorite method, which is hand quilting. As dry leaves that before the wild hurricane fly, when they meet with an obstacle mount to the sky. So this quilt was made by me. I wanted to depict a snowy winter's evening or night. We have a lot of mice around here because we live in the country, but this little guy chose to sleep in a walnut shell. He is covered with a miniature quilt, and there's also miniature quilts in the trees that come from an antique quilt that was in disrepair. I cut the leaves from flannel, and they are actually dimensional, and a little frayed, which shows the crinkly oak leaves that fall late in the fall. And then we have the forest scene in the back, which our house is surrounded by. So up to the housetop, the coursers, they flew with a sleigh full of toys, and St. Nicholas too. And this is another quilt that I made. It depicts my home in the Litchfield Hills of Connecticut. I live in a stone house, so each of these stones are stitched down to represent a true depiction of the house. Again, I have the Christmas trees, the trees that are pieced in. We always have a wreath on our front door and a tree in the window. And there is Santa in silhouette flying with his sleigh full of toys, and the miniature quilt is on the sleigh. And then in a twinkling, I heard on the roof the prancing and pawing of each little poof. This quilt was made by Jane Steffens of Racine, Wisconsin. In Jane's own words, the verse of the night before Christmas seemed to call for an audio interpretation. So the challenge for her was to see the sound. Yikes! Visions of 8 reindeers and all 32 hooves danced in her head, but refused to take shape on cloth. So she settled for depicting dancing hooves. She added a little glitz with metallic thread, since dancers seem to like glitz. Jane hopes that the viewers of this piece can hear those reindeer. As I drew in my head, I was turning around. Down the chimney St. Nicholas came with bound. This quilt was made by Kathy Cray of Ormond Beach, Florida. Kathy was inspired by her childhood memories and her intrigue of who actually Santa was. Above the fireplace is a photo of Kathy and her sister sitting on Santa's lap. Here she's sneaking a peek at Santa as he descends into their comfy living room on Christmas Eve. I love the dog and the cat in this one. And you can see Kathy incorporated quilts at the top and then around the border of the larger quilt. He was dressed all in fur from his head to his foot, and his clothes were all tarnished with ashes and soot. This quilt was made by Sarah Farley of Wichita, Kansas. Sarah's inspiration came from two sources: the traditional chimney sweep block, seen as a fireback, and her collection of St. Nicholas figures. Her favorite St. Nics have long robes in the European style. So her St. Nicholas has a long red robe trimmed with sooty fur, of course, from sweeping down the chimney. A bundle of toys he had flung on his back, and he looked like a peddler just opening his pack. This quilt was made by Karen Alexander of Lopez Island, Washington. And for Karen, this was a walk down memory lane. She used a lot of the fabric that was in her mother-in-law's collection of fabric, and also some from her girlfriends on Lopez Island from her guild. This quilt definitely has lots of memories of stories for Karen. Her main inspiration came from an image she found online from a circa 1900 child's book. The musical notes of the stocking fabric, as well as the musical instruments under the tree and in Santa's pack, are a salute to her husband and their mutual love for choral music. The Christmas tree in the fireplace is cut from a tiny segment of an old damaged quilt. And if you're looking for the miniature quilt, it's right at the top, and that was from a piece of fabric that she found in her mother-in-law's stash. His droll little mouth was drawn up like a bow, and the beard on his chin was as white as the snow. This quilt was made by Shannon Shirley of Rhodesville, Virginia. Shannon used wool felt with wool roving for Santa's beard, covered with tulle to minimize bearding. The entire piece is hand embroidered with a blanket stitch because this is wool. I used a Derwent Intense watercolor pencil to add color to the rosy cheeks and his nose. The final detail was to add 2 crystals to give Santa's eyes a twinkle. And the ball at the end of his hat is where she has her miniature quilt detail, which is Winding Ways, which is a very fun quilt design. His droll little mouth was drawn up like a bow, and the beard on his chin was as white as the snow. This quilt was made by Mary Walter of Southborough, Massachusetts. Mary envisioned an old-fashioned Santa and chose a Scandinavian Santa, making his way through the piney starlit woods to visiting children. His hooded red wool cloak and white beard were a welcome sight to anyone who chanced to see him in the wee small hours delivering gifts. Mary included her miniature quilts as the piece background of the trees, and she created the beard using a combination of applique white base fabric, which was torn, knotted, and couched into strips and then sewn in swirls. The stump of a pipe he held tight in his teeth, and the smoke had encircled his head like a wreath. This quote was made by Bonnie Jordan of Vienna, Virginia. She writes, Clemency Moore's world-famous poem includes a stanza and numerous images and prints through time and provide inspiration. Though some modern print versions may have deleted a few lines, St. Nick's pipe smoking seemed right and in keeping with other Victorian customs no longer practiced. Bunny deliberately made the pipe a little dramatic to help place it in the past. The smoke incorporates several materials and several techniques. Santa's bag of toys is made from a recycled 1980s miniature quilt and cutouts of several themed fabrics. Additionally, piecing was used on the bag, Santa's bag, and on the strap and the front of Santa's suit. He had a broad face and a little round belly that shook when he laughed like a bowl full of jelly. This quote was made by Barb Vetter of Madison, Connecticut. Barb reflected on the memories and decorations of her childhood when considering her quilt. Her family had a collection of Santa elves that were round with pointed flocked paper hats and black wooden feet. They all wore this expression of mirth. The Peanuts Christmas special inspired her tree. As a young child, she marveled at the aluminum tree park full of tall, brightly colored trees, and she included bubblegum pink because her Christmases always included a lot of new pink Barbie gifts. He was chubby and plump, a right jolly old elf, and I laughed when I saw him in spite of myself. This quote was made by Bonnie Dwyer of Manchester, Maine. Bonnie wanted to create a very simple modern Santa and to make it a little bit humorous. She found a chubby elf-like Santa image created from just a circle to achieve her goal. The googly eyes added a little humor. Fabric scraps from her stash provided the small cheater fabric for Santa's sack, and that is the miniature quilt there. A wink of his eye and a twist of his head soon gave me to know I had nothing to dread. This quote was made by Mary Kerr of Woodbridge, Virginia. Mary was inspired to create a collage quilt when she found this vintage Santa stocking from circa 1950. She loved the quirkiness of the sequins and the felted texture and paired the fragments of a vintage red and white top with the cutter quilt base. Vintage rickrack and buttons were added with additional sparkles to finish the scene. He spoke not a word, but went straight to his work and filled all the stockings in turn with a jerk. This quote was made by Shannon Shirley of Rhodesville, Virginia. Shannon also loves to incorporate vintage textiles into her quilts. She used vintage orphan blocks, dresser scarves, chenille bedspreads, trim, tatting, and part of the cutter quilt to finish her piece. The miniature quilt designs can be found in the Winding Ways background and Santa's sack of presents. And you can see that on the cradle, there is of the nativity scene, which shows the true meaning of Christmas. We have another miniature quilt there. And laying a finger aside of his nose and giving a nod up the chimney he rose. This quote was made by Brenda Grampus of Brooksville, Florida. As a traditional quilter, Brenda knew immediately that she wanted Irish chain wallpaper with the fireplace and floor area at the bottom. She set a log cabin Christmas tree to one side with Santa front and center. This piece includes needle turn applique using fussy cuts from specialty fabrics. Santa's wool suit is raw edge applique with hand ink detail. His face is hand drawn. His hair, beard, eyebrows are Brazilian embroidery with bullion stitches. The holly branches are hand embroidery with hand beaded berries. Brenda included vintage doilies to serve as the rug and the tree skirt. She states, "Christmas is a special time of year for me. I wanted to express my traditional impression of this classic poem." He sprang to his sled, to his team gave a whistle, and away they all flew like the down of the thistle. This quilt was a collaboration between Karen Dever of Morristown, New Jersey, and Janet Cohen of Cherry Hill, New Jersey. It was a collaboration between a traditional quilter, which I'm assuming is Karen, and a more experienced art quilter, which I'm assuming is Janet, who belonged to a quilt guild called the Needle and Gun Quilt Club of New Jersey. And they call themselves that because a number of the ladies who are members were former FBI agents. They used a technique of Judy Rowley of Vermont to create the houses that Santa would fly over. Janet drew the life-size picture of the quilt. Then they began cutting the design apart for their templates. Janet painted the face of a Santa. They purchased earrings for the whistle that arrived from England and charms to be toys coming out of a sack. Karen learned how to use Angelina fiber and added beads for the down of the thistle. Their miniature quilt is Santa's sack. They thoroughly enjoyed working together, trading lots of laughs, creating their unique quilt for this book and this celebration. But I heard him exclaim ere he drove out of sight, "Happy Christmas to all, and to all a good night." This quilt was made by Alma Motes of Pensacola, Florida. Alma states, "I was pleased to get the opportunity to participate in this exhibit. All of the patterns that she used are her own design. Her interpretation of Santa's departure is set in present-day rural America. As the man of the house watches Santa fly out of sight, he stands on the second-floor balcony wrapped in a quilt. Santa did not forget the woodland creatures. He placed presents for them under the old tree in the backyard." So Merry Christmas to everybody. I hope you enjoyed the presentation. I just want to tell you that these quilts are currently on exhibit for those of you that live within the tri-state area or are coming to New England for the month of December. They are on exhibit at the Judy Black Memorial Park and Gardens in Washington Depot. The opening night is December 4th, and they will be up until December 30th. Call the website of the Judy Black Memorial Park for hours because they are open not on Wednesdays and not always on the weekend, but that can be arranged, or you can contact me and I can give you a special tour. Then the quilts from here are going to be going to the Paducah Rotary Show at the Carson Center in Paducah, Kentucky. That is from April 26th to April 30th in 2022. And after that, they will be at the National Quilt Museum for the Christmas season from November to probably the beginning of January of 2023. We do have a book about the quilts and the wonderful artist interpretations. I would like to thank all the artists for making a quilt and making this book possible. Every quilt is so unique and personalized, and it was truly a wonderful experience working with all of you. If you would like a copy of the book that's signed, you can contact me. This is my website, or you can send me a text, and I'd be happy to sign the book for you. You can also order it locally at buy it locally at the Hickory Stick Bookstore, which is across from the Judy Black Center, or you can order it from our publisher. Thank you.
Alrighty, well, thank you so much, Sue. That was a wonderful presentation. I wrote many notes, learned many things, but I just think, especially with the night before Christmas quilts, we have one in our exhibit, which you can actually see over my left shoulder, the red and white one here, that we used to talk about quilting as something that brings people together, as something that's a social activity and a communal activity. And I think this is just such a good example of that tradition carrying forward, not just for you and the quilters who participated, but for all the people who will come together to see these on display. It's a really wonderful project.
Good.
So
It was lots of fun, and people were very enthusiastic. I think when I put out the call for the quilt challenge, within 24 hours, every stanza had been claimed, and people just dug in and made the quilts, and they're all fabulous. So
yeah, wow, it is a very amazing story. So now that we've wrapped up, if anyone has questions that you about those quilts, about quilts in general, red and green quilts, anything, you can go ahead and pop those in the question and answer feature that's at the bottom of your screen, or in the chat if you want to do that as well. And then we'll get those answered while we're here. I've also put in the chat the link to the quilts that were done during the Connecticut Quilt Search Project, the quiltindex.org website's there. So if you want to see some of the quilts that Sue and many others sort of worked on and came and studied and photographed and put in that database, you can do that as well. And again, if you have any questions at all about quilts for Sue, or anything to ask about the exhibit that we had at this historic site, I'd be happy to answer that. My question that I've sort of asked everyone, especially for quilts people, is if in all the time that you spent looking at quilts in Connecticut in particular, did you have a favorite, or is there one that is very memorable to you, or one that stands out? I know it's hard. I change my favorite quilt in our collection all the time, but.
So during the Connecticut Quilt Search Project, we saw really the gamut of quilts that were mostly 19th century, early 20th century. We saw very little very few quilts that were made 1940, 1930, and our cutoff date was 1950. So anything that was brought in after 1950, we documented, but we didn't include it in the book. I think I have a soft spot in my heart for signature quilts, and because I think that signature quilts not only are quilts, are the material object, but they give you a few clues. And in many cases, because you have signatures and you can find the provenance of where the quilt was made, or the stories of some of the people, it's like a snapshot in time of a village, or of an event such as a marriage, or a farewell, or to a minister. So I think the signature quilts were my absolute favorite, to be able to document those and then do the research for the book. It was really a great experience. I think for anybody that really is maybe just beginning the study of quilts, if you go back and study the documentation books, or if your state has resurrected their documentation project and is revisiting that, certainly get involved, because you really learn a lot about quilts through actually seeing them come across the tables of the documentation project.
Yeah, our exhibit was both a celebration of quilts as visual objects that just look wonderful, but really about the stories that quilts can tell, and the number of different stories that quilts can tell. And signature quilts are a great example. And one of our favorite pieces we had was a crazy quilt that they actually used sentimental fabrics, or fabrics that were meaningful to the family in the construction of the crazy quilt. So if you look closely, you can see things like a ribbon from a GAR reunion, that the person who made it was a plum, and was a descendant of someone who served and was killed in the Civil War. It's just really, quilts like that are just so, you can really realize that they're personal stories. They're examples of our town's history. They're just beautiful things to look at, and they're really diverse objects in what they can tell us.
Well, and when we wrote our book, and we picked out about 150 quilts that we knew had strong Connecticut provenance, because we really wanted to tell the story of Connecticut quilts. Sometimes it was hard to convince an owner to allow their quilt to be published. And the way I approached it was, I've researched this quilt. I have the story of the quilt maker, and who she was married to, because women historically back in the 19th century were only usually recorded in the census in terms of their husband or their father. You know, it wasn't until after 1840 that they got their own name in the census. So, so in researching the provenance of the quilt, I felt my argument was, you have the material object, I have the history. So it's like putting two pieces of a puzzle together. So let's make a whole, and then we can have the full story about the quilt and the quilt maker, and make it even better.
Yeah. For many of the the early quilts in our collection, it's the only record we have of that individual, especially like you said, of that woman, because women were the ones making most of these quilts, and for that reason, there's such important things for us to both preserve but make accessible and share with everyone. So we had a couple questions come in. One was a logistics question about this presentation, and we are recording it. And I think we talked to Sue and be happy to share it with people who are interested in seeing it again or sharing it with someone they know. We had one question that was, I think, referring to the Night Before Christmas book, project. How long did it take from idea to getting the published book? So I guess people are curious about how long it take to make the quilts and get all that together.
So we had a little thing happen called COVID, and that set us back 2 years basically. And the book was supposed to be out last year, and then we had COVID, so we couldn't get the photography done within the appropriate time frame. And then had insult to injury, the books got stuck on one of those ships out in Long Beach for about 2 months. So they actually just arrived about 2 weeks ago, and I was able to get a lot of the pre-advanced orders out. But I started the project a little under 4 years ago, and it took people about 1.5 years to finally get all the quilts made, and then we had COVID hit, and so that set us back. But when you write a book, writing a book and making a quilt is very similar. You get inspired, you have this image of what you want your book to look like you have what you want your quilt to look like, and then you start putting the pieces together. And making a quilt takes a while, as does writing a book. But I was really happy with the way this book turned out, and I think that I'm so excited to have the exhibit traveling, because I think that it really touches the heart of young and old, and we all grew up loving the Night Before Christmas, and we still do. So yeah, I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, they can let, yeah, and if you have any more specifics, whoever that asked the question, just let us know. But I'm gonna go ahead. Someone asked if we could put your website and or your contact information in the chat, so I'm gonna go ahead and drop that in as well.
Okay.
So there's that. And if as a last resort, if anyone wants to get in touch with Sue, they can always reach out to us. We'll happily get you guys in touch to order the book. And the last thing I'm going to drop in chat is a link to our website, because we did, for this event, we wanted to make sure we got it done in time. We made a virtual exhibit of our quilt exhibit. So that closed on Sunday to the public. We had a special reception yesterday to sort of say a final goodbye. But if you weren't able to see it and you'd like to at least learn about the quilts and see some photographs of the quilts beyond the wall, I know it's nothing could be as good as seeing the quilts in person, but at least you can get an experience that way. So if there's any other questions, go ahead and drop those in. We'll try to answer them. But in the meantime, I just want to thank Sue. That was wonderful and a great way to start, or I guess start December and get us all in the holiday spirit. And a really fun way for us at the Historical Society to say goodbye to our quilts, is to see something that is going forward and many people see. And if you are in the Washington Depot area or anywhere around and you want to go see that, you can reach out to Sue or us and we can get you that information as well. And then if you want to join us at the Society for some more programming, we have a holiday themed More Than Just History virtual trivia night next Thursday, December 9th. That'll be here on Zoom. That'll be a lot of fun. We just wrote those questions today and they're really fun and holiday themed. And then we have 2 holiday-themed lantern tours of Litchfield's Historic District on December 14th and 17th at 5:30. And you can find that information on our website. And I don't see any more questions, so I think we're good to end there. And I just want to thank everyone who came today, everyone who participated, and I hope you had a great time. And we hope to see you at another virtual lecture or in-person event in the future. And again, just a big thank you to Sue and for both presenting and for organizing this wonderful project. So it was.
And Merry Christmas.
Merry Christmas and happy holidays, and we wish you all well. And maybe we'll see some of you in the next couple of weeks.